Auschwitz didn't become the deadliest Nazi camp overnight. It started as a prison camp and soon grew step by step into a vast complex where families were separated, forced labor broke bodies, and gas chambers ended lives in hours. The hell of this concentration camp became one of the darkest chapters in human history. It goes back to early 1940 in the Polish town of Auschwitz, when German forces took over a set of old Polish army barracks that had been damaged and abandoned after the invasion of Poland in September 1939. That invasion, ordered by Adolf Hitler, had already crushed the country in a matter of weeks. And now the Nazis were looking for ways to control the population and silence any resistance. The location of Auschwitz made it useful because it was connected to rail lines and far enough from major cities to keep things hidden. The Germans renamed the site Auschwitz concentration camp, using the German version of the town's name, and quickly began turning it into a prison camp. At the beginning, the main targets were Polish political prisoners. These weren't random people. They included teachers, lawyers, priests, former soldiers, and anyone who might inspire others to resist German rule. The Nazis believed that if they removed these people, the rest of the population would be easier to control. Many of those arrested had already been through interrogations, beatings, and prison before being sent to Auschwitz. By the time they arrived, they were already weak and shaken, which made it easier for the guards to dominate them from the start. The man chosen to run this new camp was Rudolf Höss. He had already worked in other camps like Dachau, so he understood how the system worked. What made him stand out was how he approached everything like a manager running a business. When the first large group of prisoners arrived in June 1940, around 728 Polish men were brought in from a prison in Tarnów. The moment they stepped off the train, the violence began. Guards shouted in German, hit people with rifle butts, and unleashed dogs to scare them into submission. Many prisoners later described that moment as when they realized they had entered a completely different world, one where normal rules no longer applied. At this stage, Auschwitz was already a place of suffering and death, but it was still mainly a forced labor camp. However, outside the camp, decisions were being made that would change everything. By 1941, the Nazis began transforming Auschwitz from a single camp into a massive complex that could handle far more prisoners and carry out new kinds of operations. The original camp, later known as Auschwitz I, was no longer enough for what they were planning, so they started building a second, much larger site nearby, called Auschwitz II-Birkenau. This new camp was located in the village of Brzezinka, just a few kilometers away, and construction began using forced labor from prisoners who were already pushed to their limits. Birkenau was designed on a completely different scale. It covered a huge area and was divided into sections separated by fences and guard towers. Long rows of wooden barracks were built quickly, often using cheap materials that provided little protection from the weather. In winter, the cold was unbearable, and in summer, the heat and mud made conditions just as difficult. The entire camp was surrounded by barbed wire fences carrying electric current, making escape almost impossible. Watchtowers were placed at regular intervals, with armed guards ready to shoot anyone who tried to get close to those fences. One of the most important features of Birkenau was the railway line that ran directly into the camp. The Nazis wanted trains to deliver prisoners straight to the center of operations without delay. At the same time, Nazis were searching for a more efficient way to kill large groups of people. Earlier methods, like mass shootings carried out by mobile killing units in Eastern Europe, were seen as too slow and psychologically difficult for the men carrying them out. The leadership wanted a method that would be faster, less direct, and easier to repeat on a large scale. This is where Zyklon B came in. Zyklon B had originally been used as a pesticide to kill insects in warehouses and ships. It came in the form of small pellets that released a deadly gas when exposed to air. In 1941, experiments began at Auschwitz to see if it could be used to kill people in enclosed spaces. The first tests were carried out on Soviet prisoners of war and some sick prisoners who were no longer considered useful for labor. These tests took place in the basement of Block 11, and later in other improvised gas chambers. The results were exactly what the Nazis were looking for. The gas worked quickly and could kill large numbers of people at once without requiring direct physical violence from guards. This made it so much easier for the system to expand. By 1942, Auschwitz had become one of the main destinations for deportation trains coming from across Nazi-occupied Europe. These transports carried Jewish families from countries like France, Hungary, Greece, and the Netherlands, along with smaller numbers of Roma people, political prisoners, and others targeted by the Nazi regime. The journey itself was already a nightmare. People were forced into cattle cars, often with more than 70 or 80 individuals packed into a single wagon. No proper ventilation, no seating, no facilities. Some journeys lasted 2 or 3 days, while others went even longer, depending on the distance. During these trips, people had almost no access to food or water. Many became severely dehydrated, especially in the summer heat. In winter, the cold could be deadly. People often collapsed during the journey, and some died before the train even reached Auschwitz. When the doors finally opened, those who survived stepped out into a scene of chaos and fear. Bright lights, shouting guards, barking dogs, and the smell of smoke from the crematoria filled the air. Most had no idea where they were or what was about to happen. The next step was a selection process, which took place almost immediately after arrival. An SS officer, sometimes a doctor, would quickly decide who was fit for labor and who was not. This decision was often made in seconds, based on appearance alone. Young and physically strong individuals were more likely to be chosen for work, while older people, small children, pregnant women, and the visibly sick were sent in the other direction. Families were separated within moments, often without any explanation, and there was no chance to say goodbye. For those who were selected to live, survival wasn't really living. It was just delaying death one more day. The moment they entered Auschwitz concentration camp, everything that made them human was stripped away. Prisoners were forced to hand over their clothes, their personal belongings, even family photos. And in return, they were given thin, striped uniforms that barely protected them from the cold. Their heads were shaved, not just for hygiene, but to erase identity. Then came the number. Instead of being called by their names, they were assigned a number, and many had that number permanently tattooed onto their arm. It wasn't just a system of organization. It was a way of turning people into objects, something easier to control and destroy. The barracks where prisoners lived were overcrowded beyond belief. Wooden structures meant for a few dozen people often held hundreds. Inside, there were rough wooden bunks stacked in levels, and sometimes 5 or 6 people had to squeeze into a space meant for one. There weren't proper mattresses, just thin straw that quickly became dirty and full of lice. Hygiene was almost impossible. There were very few washing facilities, and even those were often unusable because of the number of prisoners. Lice spread everywhere, and with them came disease. Typhus became one of the biggest killers inside the camp, spreading fast through the packed living conditions. Once someone got sick, they usually didn't recover, because there was no real medical care, only neglect. Food was one of the biggest struggles. Prisoners were given just enough to keep them barely alive. A typical day might include a thin, watery soup made from turnips or cabbage, a small piece of bread, and sometimes a bit of margarine or sausage if they were lucky. That was all. People were constantly hungry, and over time their bodies began to break down. They lost weight rapidly, their bones became visible, and they became too weak to work properly, which only made things worse because weakness often led to punishment or selection for death. Work began before sunrise and could last for hours without proper rest. Prisoners were sent out in groups to perform heavy labor, often in terrible weather conditions. Some worked inside the camp, building and expanding it, while others were sent to nearby industrial sites. One of the biggest employers was IG Farben, which ran a large factory complex near the camp. Prisoners there were forced to work long hours producing materials for the German war effort, including synthetic rubber and fuel. The work was exhausting, and guards watched closely for any sign of slowing down. If someone couldn't keep up, they were beaten immediately. If they collapsed from exhaustion, they were often left where they fell or taken away and never seen again. Punishments inside the camp were meant to create fear and total control. Public hangings were carried out in front of other prisoners as a warning. People were forced to stand and watch as others were executed, so the message was clear. There were also punishment cells, including standing cells where prisoners were locked into tiny spaces so small they couldn't sit or lie down. They'd be kept there for hours or even days without food or water. Many did not survive these punishments. Another horror of the camp were the experiments carried out by Josef Mengele. He arrived in the camp in 1943. He was a trained doctor, but instead of helping people, he used his position to carry out experiments that had no real medical purpose, only curiosity and ideology behind them. Mengele was especially interested in twins, particularly children. When new trains arrived, he often stood on the selection ramp, watching closely for twins or people with unusual physical features. When he found them, he separated them from the rest of the group and sent them to his laboratory instead of the gas chambers. For a moment, this could look like survival, but in reality, it was just a different kind of suffering. Inside his lab, these children were used for experiments that were both painful and deadly. They were injected with unknown chemicals, sometimes to see how their bodies would react. Others were deliberately infected with diseases like typhus, to show how illness spread and how long it took to kill. There was no concern for their health or survival. These experiments were done without anesthesia, meaning the victims felt everything. Mengele was also obsessed with eye color. He tried to change the color of children's eyes by injecting chemicals directly into them, causing severe pain, infections, and often blindness. In other cases, he ordered surgeries where body parts were altered or removed, just to compare differences between individuals. Some twins were killed so their bodies could be dissected and studied side by side. These weren't medical procedures in any real sense. They were acts of cruelty, carried out under the cover of science. Many victims died during these experiments, and those who survived were often left with permanent injuries, both physical and mental. They carried these scars for the rest of their lives. And while Mengele became one of the most well-known figures, he was not the only one. Other doctors in Auschwitz also carried out experiments, though his name became the most infamous because of the scale and brutality of what he did. At the center of Auschwitz-Birkenau was a system built entirely around killing people as quickly and efficiently as possible. The gas chambers and crematoria were not hidden away randomly. They were carefully designed and placed to handle large numbers of victims every single day. When transports arrived, most people were sent directly towards these buildings, without realizing what was about to happen. The process was built on deception. Victims were told they were going to take a shower and be disinfected before entering the camp. They were ordered to undress and leave their belongings neatly, with instructions to remember where they placed everything so they could find it later. This made people less likely to panic, which allowed the guards to move large groups through the system quickly. Once inside the chamber, the doors were sealed tightly. These rooms were designed to look like showers, sometimes even with fake shower heads on the ceiling. But instead of water, guards used the same Zyklon B. The pellets were dropped through openings in the roof or walls, and within minutes, the gas filled the room. People realized what was happening, and panic spread instantly. They tried to escape, pushing toward doors that would never open. Those closer to the openings where the gas entered died first, while others struggled longer. The process usually took around 15 to 20 minutes, though it could vary depending on conditions inside the chamber. After the gas had done its work, the doors were opened, and another group of prisoners, known as Sonderkommando, was forced to enter. These prisoners had one of the most horrifying roles in the entire camp. They had to remove the bodies, untangle them, and prepare them for cremation. Before the bodies were burned, they were searched for valuables. Gold teeth were pulled out, hair was cut, and anything useful was taken. The bodies were then moved to the crematoria, where they were burned in large furnaces. When the number of victims was too high, bodies were burned in open pits outside. The process ran day and night without stopping. At its peak, Auschwitz could kill thousands of people in a single day, making it one of the deadliest killing centers in history. Even in a place built on fear and control, resistance still existed, though it looked very different from what people might expect. It wasn't always about open rebellion, because that usually meant immediate death. Instead, resistance often took small, quiet forms. Prisoners shared food with each other, even when they were starving themselves. Some secretly passed messages between different parts of the camp. Others tried to document what was happening, hiding notes or writing down details in the hope that someone would find them later. One of the most significant acts of resistance happened in 1944, carried out by members of the Sonderkommando. These prisoners knew better than anyone what was happening in the gas chambers and crematoria, and they also knew they were unlikely to survive for long. Despite this, they managed to organize an uprising. With the help of explosives that had been smuggled into the camp by female prisoners working in a munitions factory, they attacked the guards and managed to destroy one of the crematoria. It was a desperate act, and they knew the consequences would be severe. Most of the prisoners involved were killed, either during the uprising or shortly after. But their actions showed that even in the worst conditions, people still resisted in whatever way they could. They refused to completely give in, even when the odds were against them. Around that same time, Auschwitz saw one of its largest waves of arrivals. In 1944, more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to the camp in just a few months. The system was pushed to its limits as trains arrived one after another. Most of these people were sent directly to the gas chambers shortly after arrival, making it one of the deadliest periods in the camp's history. By late 1944, it was becoming clear that Nazi Germany was losing the war. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, getting closer to Poland and the area around Auschwitz. The SS began to realize that they would not be able to hold the camp for much longer, and they started trying to erase evidence of what had happened there. Documents were burned, buildings were partially dismantled, and some of the gas chambers and crematoria were destroyed. The goal was to hide the scale of the crimes before the enemy arrived. At the same time, they began evacuating prisoners from the camp, forcing them to march westward, deeper into Germany. In January 1945, around 56,000 prisoners were forced to leave Auschwitz in what became known as death marches. These marches took place in freezing winter conditions, with little food or rest. Prisoners who were too weak to continue were shot along the way. Many died from exhaustion, cold, or starvation before reaching their destination. On January 27, 1945, Soviet soldiers finally reached Auschwitz. What they found shocked even experienced soldiers. Around 7,000 prisoners had been left behind, most of them too weak or sick to move. They were starving, ill, and barely alive. The camp itself was filled with evidence of what had happened. Piles of shoes, suitcases, glasses, and other personal belongings taken from victims. These items showed just how many people had passed through the camp and never returned. By the time the camp was liberated, over 1.1 million people had been killed at Auschwitz. Around 90% of them were Jewish. Others included Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and political prisoners. After the war, Rudolf Höss was captured, tried, and executed in 1947, near the camp he once ran. Many other Nazis were also brought to justice during trials like the Nuremberg trials. But for survivors, justice didn't erase what they had been through. They had lost their families, homes, entire communities, and the memories stayed with them for life.